Hello and good evening. Welcome to another episode of the News Project Live. Episode 14, a conversation with Norm Pearlstine, Rethinking the LA Times in Challenging Times. Norm Pearlstine is the executive editor of the Los Angeles Times, and this week he announced that he intends to leave his position. His storied career includes stints at the Wall Street Journal, Time Inc., and Bloomberg LP. The News Project Live is a weekly conversation with media industry experts and innovators about the future of news, brought to you by the News Project. Our hosts are Merrill Brown, CEO, and Alex Leo, Head of Audience. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Without further ado, Merrill Brown and Alex Leo.
Good evening from New York City. I'm Merrill Brown and of the News Project, and welcome to tonight's edition of the News Project Live. Thanks for joining us. Thursday evening with co-host Alex Leo, TNP brings you smart media minds to talk about news industry business issues that make the world of running news organizations so challenging. Tonight's a conversation with one of the country's most respected editors, Los Angeles Times executive editor Norm Pearlstine. We'll talk to Norm about change and challenge at the LA Times. This is a timely conversation as Norm has just announced plans to step down as soon as a successor is identified. At our company, The News Project, we are working to build technology and services to help small to medium-sized news organizations address the product and business challenges faced by news today. Our work has ranged from a news site in Brooklyn to a newspaper in Montana and one of California's most influential news outlets. Our goal is to help news organizations produce great product and seek sustainable models. More on our work later in the program when Alex Leo and I provide you with a look at TNP. Alex joins us tonight from her home in Washington, D.C. Good evening, Alex.
Hi, Merrill. Hi, all. Please tell us where you're watching from in the comments and send us your questions for Norm and for us. And we'll talk a little later. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Alex. The challenge of making sense of the busted traditional newspaper model was tough enough. Then came COVID-19, significantly reducing ad dollars, but at the same time, increasing the public's need for local news. The LA Times was an independent company, Times Mirror at one point, then part of Tribune, and was purchased by billionaire Patrick Soon-Shiong, who immediately put Norm Pearlstine in charge when he took control in mid-2008. Norm's tenure has been marked by great journalism, business model challenges, and unprecedented self-examination of the paper's history on race relations, both in terms of coverage and hiring. Both on its editorial pages and in its news pages, the paper has acknowledged weakness in hiring a diverse staff and weakness in their coverage and editorials on these matters. These stories are well worth your time and worth reading. We'll talk about these race matters, the climate for local news, and the work of the Times with Norm. Norm is reported from around the world, was the first managing editor of the Asian Wall Street Journal. He had a long Wall Street Journal career and was the paper's executive editor. He was the editor-in-chief of Time Incorporated, where he did 2 stints, and was the chief content officer at Bloomberg. Norm, welcome to the News Project Live. We're pleased to have you here. Before we dive into all the matters at hand, how's lockdown life for you, and how has it been running the Times from an apartment in Los Angeles?
Right. Well, we went into lockdown on March 10th, and I was very concerned at first about whether we would be able to continue the kind of journalism that we'd done, not only because we were out of our newsroom, but because with the pandemic, we were really restricting what our reporters were doing. We've ended up learning that you can publish from a remote distance, and I think that our reporters have frankly been doing heroic work over the last 7 or 8 months under just extraordinarily difficult circumstances.
That's great to hear, Norm. Norm, you've been in newsrooms and you've managed news organizations in multiple settings during harrowing times. With President Trump, race relations, fire, climate, and now, of course, COVID-19, really nothing tops this in the post-World War history in terms of a newsworthy period. How do you look at this moment in terms of news and trying to solve the challenge of creating a sustainable, large news organization with so much going on?
Sure. Well, you've really summarized exactly what this year has been like. I began the year by thinking that the election was the only story, and that if we were prepared to cover it, we would be fine. The unfortunate and tragic death of Kobe Bryant in the end of January was the first challenge to that assumption, and then followed very quickly by the COVID pandemic, with the constraints that it imposed on us, and the challenges to our business model that came with the decline in the economy. And then, of course, the ways in which the protest movement itself, a critically important story, beginning with the death of Floyd, was important. And then the migration of the protest movement, if you will, from the streets into our newsrooms has been an added challenge, and one that I think will lead to some good results, although sometimes painful getting there.
Yeah.
And what has it meant? What has all this meant for audience and subscriber revenue?
Well, first, advertising revenue has taken a real hit for a number of reasons. We are particularly dependent on the entertainment industry, where we, for instance, have seen the Oscars push back a couple months. We've seen Disney cancel a whole fall series of movies, which will be airing next summer. And yet at the same time, it has been a time where there's never been a greater demand for information at all levels of society. And so our digital subscriptions are up sharply, our television audience has been growing, and our print audience has held.
I just want to say hi to a few of our viewers. Peter Kreisky saying hi from Newbury, Peter Kreslowski from Smoky, Southern Oregon, Leslie Fuller from Indianapolis, Sri Srinivasan from New York City, Aparna from LA, Corey from Phoenix, and my mother, Jackie Leo, who is sad to hear Norm is leaving the LA Times.
Hey, Jackie, how are you?
Norm, you touched on it a little bit, but can you tell us more about how your coverage approach has changed because of the pandemic, and if you're offering any products that you weren't before as a result of this time?
Well, we did do a podcast for 40 days during the height of uncertainty about the pandemic that was a new product. I would say that we've also refocused a lot of our local coverage, where we've always been very strong on accountability journalism. We've augmented that with some real efforts at service journalism, that whether it's a tracker for the fires or for the coronavirus, or whether it is just informing people about when schools are open, or whether the Pac-12 is going to be playing or not. These kinds of stories resonate with our audience because there's utility to them. And while we are of course more than just local, our ability, I think, to really cover Los Angeles and Southern California has been a place that has distinguished us.
Interesting.
One example that I'm sure you confronted, and we'll move on to many other matters as the conversation evolves, is restaurants. Right. Los Angeles is legendarily a restaurant innovative haven. Your coverage is renowned largely through the work of some of the great restaurant writers sort of in the history of the medium. Restaurant scene is not what it was, obviously. How are you handling that?
Well, it's so far been an interesting shift for us. We have a quite vigorous takeout business from a number of restaurants, and that has prompted some continuing coverage of restaurants. But increasingly, I think that we are focusing on families where people are trying to feed a family of four on a budget. So We've been doing a lot of coverage about cooking, about recipes, about new ways to really tell stories about families and about different specialties. Last week, we did an entire food supplement on kimchi because we have a very large Korean American audience here and a very large number of Angelenos for whom Korean food is a staple.
Right. We know you have a very strong point of view about the need for newspapers to embrace multimedia production and video programming. Why is it so important, and what has the Times done to address these strategic interests?
Sure. Well, I think that we basically started asking the question when the sale was completed, where do we at the Los Angeles Times have license to go into new areas? Where can we be the best, and where do we have to be competitive? And I think we quickly concluded that while ad support for media, and particularly for print, would continue to be in decline, not quite as quickly as we anticipated as the pandemic has made it. But we also felt that like many other organizations, there were opportunities in podcasts, there were opportunities with mobile, opportunities with events, and including virtual, such as this one. And I also think that the trend toward video and toward visual has really accelerated this year as well. We have done a few things in that direction. We are finishing a world-class food kitchen, for example, where we can do much more with video. We do an hour-long news program on Spectrum 4 nights a week, very similar to what New York One does. And that show has been a very successful one for us. And we've been streaming a great deal of video as well. For example, we did a focus group right after the first Trump-Biden debate, and we ended up getting 1 million viewers on it.
Wow. That's great.
So it is central, you would advise, to those in the audience who run news organizations, who run legacy news organizations, if you will, newspapers and print-based organizations, that video be central to what they do. Is that right?
Well, I think it's one of many things that you want to do. I think that you have to be, I hate the jargon because we've all used it for so long, of being platform agnostic,
Right.
I think is what we all say, but there is some truth to that. That, for example, one of the things that I think grew out of our discussions over the summer was a feeling that we should rededicate ourselves to addressing the very large audience in Southern California that in the past has not felt either that the Los Angeles Times was creating content that was important to it or necessary to it. And in doing that, I think it's not just about hiring people who are very close to the communities that we want to cover, or that we redirect subject matter, but that we also think about presentation. And if you're going to be going after new audiences, you have to be prepared to do so on new platforms.
Norm, we at News Project view reader revenue as really central to the future of news organizations. How do you assess the Times' ability to get people to pay you for both subscription, but also for other products or membership, or how do you look at all that?
Well, we look at it, first of all, by saying that we have a lot of ground to cover in a hurry, that as part of Tribune, with a lot of turmoil in the dozen years prior to Patrick Soon-Shiong's acquisition, there was not very much investment in either technology or in new products. And and a lot of the business functions were consolidated in Chicago. So we had to do a lot of rebuilding just to get to the starting line.
Right.
And then I think it is just critically important that we recognize that we have to create content people will pay for. I think that in the short term, that suggests a really increased focus on local, on Southern California, but that we are blessed as being a publication centered in Los Angeles, a creative capital of the world, in having content that people outside the region also have great interest in. So about 25% of our digital subscribers are outside of Southern California.
We just had the graphic on the screen, Norm, of their current subscription offer. It's $1 for 8 weeks. That's a pretty good deal, wouldn't you think?
Yes, it is. It's not inconsistent with deals that other publications have. I got an offer from the New York Times this week it was only open for 24 hours, but it was, I think, $1 a week for the first year or something like that. So there are a lot of different offers that people are trying. I think that it's always a balancing act between wanting to create a price that gets people interested, and then get a price that we can actually sustain a newsroom, because we have revenues to put against it.
Yeah. Merrill, speaking of revenue and building a business, can you tell our viewers a little bit more about what we do at TNP?
Thanks, Alex. Just briefly, we provide a complete technology platform for our customers that allows them to build their entire news site and manage it on our platform. We also offer a variety of services, including audience development, which is one of the things you, Alex, manage. We also offer consulting services of other kinds. We offer revenue tools and strategy. We offer business development services. We offer registration and the management of the kinds of reader-paid services that Norm was just referring to. It's a complete suite of services, and our goal is to help people get off the ground, or to help news organizations who are maturing develop a more sophisticated approach to both their technology and their business. And we're open for all sorts of conversations about those two examples, and please contact us. You can reach Alex at thenewsproject.net, or you can reach me, Merrill, at thenewsproject.net. Alex?
Thanks, Merrill. So Norm, you mentioned your billionaire owner before, and he wasn't planning on this happening. So how has he reacted? Is he giving you guys the leeway you need, or how is he reacting to the evolving times?
Right. Well, I think it's worth noting that Patrick had an extraordinary career spanning decades developing vaccines. And so when the coronavirus became obviously important, he really rededicated himself to creation of vaccines. He'd been working on vaccines for pancreatic, breast, and bladder cancer, but he really threw a lot of his resources and a lot of his own time into working on a vaccine. One side effect of that was that he also did 3 very compelling videos on the science of the coronavirus. So we were the beneficiaries of. He has, I think, recognized that the pandemic has accelerated trends that were already in place. And I think he is anxious to see us come up with line extensions that recognize that change. I think he's also, as a pragmatic business executive, asking what can we stop doing at a time when we're full of ideas about things that we want to be doing.
Right. So just a reminder to our audience, please send us your questions for Norm or for Merrill, and tell us where you're watching from. Merrill?
Thanks, Alex. Norm, you've been confronted with a history of problems on race relations, problems that you watched in other newsrooms develop, and in yours particularly aggressively. You did a Reckoning with Racism series on the LA Times history, a lengthy news story. LA Times faces painful reckoning over race in its staff and pages. I don't think anybody's faced this more comprehensively than the LA Times has, but it's a problem that news executives are looking at throughout the country. Tell us a little bit about how all this evolved.
Sure. Well, first of all, with the, as I say, the migration of the protest movement into the newsroom, some very serious questions and then charges developed with regard to the hiring that we had done from the time the sale was completed through this summer, where the very strong feeling that came out of the newsroom was that we had not been aggressive enough in becoming more inclusive, and that as a consequence, we did not have as many people of color at every level of the newsroom, and that had not only consequences for the makeup of the newsroom, but for our coverage. And I think some of that really we sensed even before this year. We had one Black reporter on the Metro staff, plus some columnists there and elsewhere. We had an example last summer when Nipsey Hussle was murdered, where we were fortunate enough that one reporter was on duty that day. If she had not been there, I'm not sure that our coverage would have been anywhere near what it should have been. The questions about race and racism and being anti-racist were played against a history within the Los Angeles Times, where for much of its career it was perceived as being either indifferent to or hostile to people of color. It also did some extraordinarily good work over many of those years, but the contrast was one that was recognized by a lot of people, and with some of our senior staffers and with some of our former staffers, there was a recollection that during the riots in 1992 and in the aftermath of them, a lot of promises had been made by the Los Angeles Times with regard to building a more diverse and more inclusive newsroom, and there was very much a sense that we had failed in that endeavor over the next 25 years, and that, I think, made the demands coming out of the newsroom that much more urgent, and the skepticism with response to just words without actions very understandable.
Just to follow up on that, Norm, I assume you went back and you read a lot of the LA Times coverage in question about race matters. Did you conclude that the paper had a real problem and had a racist approach to some of these issues?
Well, I think that it's a 100-year history of the Los Angeles Times, and that if you think about not only the Los Angeles Times, but the city of Los Angeles through much of that period, you see lots of examples of incredible hostility to people of color, talking about marauding, talking about, during the internment, supporting the government's decision to basically imprison Japanese Americans. There were just many different examples. And one of the outgrowths of this heightened sensitivity within the newsroom was the creation of both Black and Latino caucuses through our guild, which came to us and to the Soon-Shiong family with a series of demands that I think we all felt were reasonable and appropriate, and which the Soon-Shiongs have embraced. And one of those was a reckoning with racism that led to a very substantial weekend section, followed by a series of stories, including first-person pieces by people who had been here in the early 90s and are still here, and who could chronicle the ups and downs during that period where, frankly, there were more downs than ups.
Yeah,
And
it is very hard to build a new future on a imperfect past without reckoning with it. So I applaud the Guild and these groups and you and everyone at the LA Times who is engaged in this for
Well,
doing
there's
it.
also been a tradition here of self-evaluation. This is not new to us. Some of you may remember the controversy over the Staples Center special
Right.
report in the late 90s, which led David Shaw, who was then the media reporter, to file, I think, a 12,000-word piece on that. So there was a tradition that a lot of people looked to in demanding that kind of self-examination. And I think correctly that if we are going to spend as much time and energy as we do seeking accountability from others, we had to be willing to take a look at ourselves.
I would commend the coverage of this topic and the self-examination to everyone watching this program. It is exceedingly interesting. It will show you how a newspaper can at least begin the process of coming to grips with its past. And I believe, Norm, nothing like it on this topic has ever been done. Is that a fair statement?
I just can't say, not at the LA Times on this subject, but there have been other pieces, individual pieces, and there's been some very good work in the past that grew out of tragedies and so forth. In the 1980s, for example, there was a very good series written by the Latino journalists who were here that won a Pulitzer for public service. But the kinds of things that we were doing both on our news pages and on our editorial pages certainly different from what's been done previously.
Right. I'm not aware of that level of self-examination anywhere other than certainly stories about, Janet Cook kinds of episodes about fraud. But for somebody to look at race so deeply, I think is an extraordinary thing to both read and assess.
So, most importantly, I think it sets the stage for us to do things that we should have gotten right the first time. And I think we're lucky to be in a company that has support from the top for really changing our approach to hiring, training, promoting, retaining talent. We did name a new masthead editor for culture and talent, April Jennings, who started work, I think, less than a month ago. And I think that that's going to really help us do a lot of things that we really should have been doing all along. And it's really a luxury to have the opportunity to try to get it right.
Alex, shall we take a reader,
Yes.
viewer question? You want to do it, or shall I?
Yes, no. Corey Salka writes, I'm curious about any comments Norm may have regarding the bogus notion of fake news, in which those who claim fake news are invariably its greatest proponents. How do we fight the notion?
It's a great question, and I've struggled with it very much because it's one of these things where even if you cover the story saying it is without sources or without attribution, just the repeating of an allegation does have consequences. And so I've toyed with the idea that when any public figure says something citing no sources or that you have no reason to believe is true, perhaps you should just have a box saying pending verification or something like that. But I think the reality is that we as a business tend to be very reactive. And even when charges are made that are false, you think about things like the charges with regard to Obama and the birther movement and so forth. Just the repeating of it in some way undermines the institutions and the individuals who are victims of that kind of attack.
We have another viewer question. I'm sorry, Merrill. We have another viewer question from Jackie Leo. Norm, what have you stopped doing to keep the revenue in balance with new projects? Have you cut back anywhere?
Yeah. Well, wouldn't say that we've cut back from what the Los Angeles Times was, say, 20 years ago. The staff at its largest was 1,250 people at the time. The acquisition was completed in June of 2018. The staff was 400. We're back up to about 540, but that doesn't enable us to do all the things that we did when we had a network of national correspondents in a couple dozen places or a very large number of people working overseas. I'd say that we've tried to struggle with what's been an existential question at the Los Angeles Times as long as anyone can remember, about how much we're local, how much we're regional, how much we're West Coast, and how much we're national or global. And I think that it really sort of depends on what we're covering. So when we're covering entertainment, I think of it very much as a global story. When we're thinking about international news, there's certainly a stronger emphasis on Mexico, Latin America, China, Pacific Rim. But just as you finish saying something like that, you have a flare up between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where a very large and meaningful population in California is very frustrated if we're not all over that kind of story. So I think just when you think you can lay down firm rules, you really have to still have the flexibility to go with the story.
Norm, this is your first position, I think, running a local daily consumer newspaper. And you've had to confront different challenges in doing so. You just addressed some of it, but you've clearly taken a different path from the Washington Post and New York Times, which have basically embraced national strategies, seeking national ad dollars, national subscribers, and so forth. How do you put California at the center of everything you're doing, as you just at least implied, while at the same time building a much larger audience?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's no easy answer to that. And if you look at the number of paid subscribers for most metro dailies, they are much smaller than we are. But if you compare us to national publications that have been working for decades, in some cases, to really expand their footprint, like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, we're really quite small in terms of our circulation. I actually am optimistic about our ability to grow, partly just because California itself is such a center of creativity. It's such a center of for technology. It is so much a part of the national and international story. So if you have a state attorney general like Becerra here in California, who has sued the EPA 3 or 4 dozen times in the last 3 years, you have a kind of Washington coverage that might be quite different from what other publications would be doing. And I think with Southern California having a population of 25 million, with the state being over 40 million, you not only can find a very big audience by covering this territory, but you also find a global audience for what's going on here.
Right. Yeah, Norm, we have a question from one of your very talented editors, Sewell Chan. He writes, what will Norm miss the most about the Los Angeles Times, from a colleague?
Well, Sewell, you and I could have a long conversation about that, but I would say that what has been most remarkable to me about the Los Angeles Times is the continuous commitment to quality journalism. Even in the years of extraordinary turmoil before Patrick completed the acquisition, I think on a day-to-day basis, the audience here was very well served by a talented and committed group of people. In our negotiations with the Guild on a first contract, wages and benefits were certainly important, but most of the negotiation was really about quality of journalism and a commitment to that. And I think really this year, with all of the complications trying to cover so many difficult stories, and with all of the internal dissent and very emotional conversations, it never came at the expense of the journalism. And I think that's a remarkable testament to the people who are here.
And I want to bring up another reader, or a viewer, I should say, question. This is from Howard Seif, a New York attorney who's a friend of the News Project. He asks basically, how can significant local and regional papers survive? And are we headed to a world of big national papers, but maybe just hyper-local papers because markets are too small? What do you think about local papers, Norm? Really, well, local papers?
I think that it's still, I think it's a very good question and a very fair one. It's one of the reasons that I have felt it so important at the Los Angeles Times that even as we double down on local coverage, that we not forsake the national or international story, because I think if all you're doing is local, it can be difficult going forward. One of the questions in the background of all of this is whether the relationship with the big platforms like Google, Facebook, Apple, and so forth change in a way that might benefit local papers. I think a second is a question of whether the model might be either a not-for-profit or having a local publication tied to other enterprises within a region, so that you're not just dependent on that standalone business model.
Norm, we've talked about it a little bit, but in terms of your successor, who you guys are looking for now, what are the most important qualities and experiences you're looking for in that person?
I think we're just beginning the process, and we really need to listen to a number of people. One of the things I've always found when you're trying to fill an important job is that if you can identify a good group of candidates and ask them for their best thinking, you sometimes learn things that you had not thought about. I do feel that anyone who succeeds me here needs to be totally committed to the ambitions to be a more inclusive newsroom. I think we are actually the most inclusive newsroom of any big news organization in the country, but relative to the number or percentage of people of color in our region, we're still well behind other organizations here. So I think being willing to embrace a lot of the things that we've made a commitment to is one thing. I think secondly, that increasingly you need to not only venerate and support a lot of the traditions that are essential to an organization, but simultaneously you have to make believers of your staff in terms of the things you want to do with new content, new platforms, and new audiences.
Norm, to get into national politics a little bit, the election is 26 days away. I assume there's a very elaborate Los Angeles Times plan to cover an election that people think may be like no other. How do you look at election night, election week, election month, or election quarter?
Norm might be frozen a little bit here to our viewers. Again, thank you for joining us. We're talking with Norm Pearlstine, and we have been discussing pandemic and news organizations, race relations, and American race problems and the pandemic. And this has been a wonderful conversation. And please send us any questions you have for Norm. We have time for a few more. We're hoping that his internet kicks back in. But Merrill, do you have any thoughts or reflections about the conversation thus far?
Well, you know, the challenge of running a newsroom these days, as Norm has had to do, is really unlike any that any newsroom executive has ever faced. It's something that, you know, Norm couldn't have been prepared for. No news executive could be. And I think it's going to be a theme in newsrooms going forward for a long period of time. This is not a moment of, a flash issue that's just going to come and go. How we deal with diversity in newsrooms and how we deal with race and similar matters around people of color in coverage is a really important issue. It has been for a long time. And Alex, you probably agree with me that it hasn't gotten enough attention.
It definitely hasn't. I mean, this reckoning is a long time coming. And, even the way we talk, we often talk about people of color and news, but a lot of the issues are specific to the Black community in LA that we've been talking about. And, the history around the riots and calling it riots at all instead of, protests or a reaction is a choice. And I think examining all of that in light of what's going on is so important, and doing it transparently is very important.
It looks like we may have lost Norm. We'll give it another couple minutes and hope that he'll rejoin. There's a look at the LA Times building in El Segundo, California. One of the recent developments at the LA Times that they moved from their storied headquarters in downtown Los Angeles to a building in El Segundo, which is right along the runways of LAX. It's quite a building, and they have quite an extraordinary newsroom there. I've been in the newsroom. It looks out on a very active runway at one of the world's busiest airports, but it's also owned by the paper's owner, which I guess has economic benefits all around to the company. But it was quite something for the Los Angeles market to lose its central newsroom, and for both the employees and the public to realize that the storied building is now just an artifact, and the new LA Times is in El Segundo.
Right.
Norm, are you back with us?
I am, and my apologies. I'm not quite sure what happened, but I just lost you.
The question. Let's resume
I think
right
it was
away.
because you were going to ask about national politics, and the computer went on default.
Norm, I said Trump, and you fled.
That's it.
Actually, the question was about how you're handling election night, week, or month, whatever it proves to be.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about that?
Well, I think we have to be, like so many people, prepared for what could be a long, drawn-out process. There are a few of us around who remember 2000 and how we were well into December before a decision was made there. This one could be just a whole lot uglier because state by state, you can imagine legal challenges. Just looking at what's going on in Pennsylvania, for instance, this week, with questions about when ballots will be counted and when they will stop and so forth, just indicates the potential for a very messy election.
Yeah.
And are you assuming in staffing the newsroom and really thinking about this, that that's a likely scenario?
Well, I think I think that we proved in 2016 how hard it is to predict the outcome of an election. I think as a manager of a newsroom, you have to assume that this is something that could go on a while, and that it's a whole lot easier to shut it down if there's a clear winner than it is to try to gear up on November 4th.
I want to raise just one more question, which is really interesting, from one of our viewers tonight, Peter Kreisky, who you may know, Norm, and is a...
Yes, I would expect any question from Peter to be interesting.
Well, he basically, his question is, you've survived for a long time in this industry. What are the values that lie at the core of your ability to excel in each new incarnation?
Well, I have always thought that the value that was most important to me was to find people who really can address the issues that we need to, and then delegate as much authority and responsibility to them as I can. That the more I can delegate, the more I get to do. And I've been fortunate enough to work with extraordinary people including here at the Los Angeles Times, who do a remarkable job every day with the things that I'm pretty happy not doing. So that would be the best answer I guess I can give you.
Well, we appreciate that. Alex, another question? Or
No, I think that's it from our viewers tonight, Norm. This has been wonderful.
Well, good. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Maybe I could just ask one of you, Merrill, when we last were speaking about the news project, you had a very deep concern, particularly for the future of not-for-profit journalism, and we're talking to a number of organizations there who do not have the kind of IT departments that, say, a large traditional news group might. I'm wondering how that part of your enterprise is working and whether it's still as important to you as it was.
It certainly is, Norm. We have supported a number of them, consulting-wise and platform-wise, including having built a new site for a really important news organization in your state, Cal Matters, and we're in conversation with many others.
We use a lot of their stuff. They're terrific.
And I think it's very clear that figuring out the nonprofit model is every bit as important to the future of news as figuring out the for-profit model. And they share a really important component, which it has been historically neglected in many nonprofits, and that is they need to be just as smart about revenue and revenue development as for-profits, because dependence on foundations or donors is a great launch strategy and maybe even an interim strategy, but it's not a long-term strategy. So we emphasize in talking to nonprofits that they need to be good at the same membership and sponsorship tools that a place like the LA Times is. And thank you for asking that question, Norm.
Okay, great. Well, it's wonderful to see both of you again, and appreciate the opportunity to join you.
Norm, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. To our audience, thanks for tuning in for what was no doubt an informative conversation about a great and important newspaper in what is the largest state and in many ways the most important state in the country. And one, by the way, Norm, that we didn't hear a lick about in last night's debate. And I believe fires and climate and California issues are really neglected in the presidential campaign, and that's unfortunate.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons why I think being a voice of the West is so important for us.
Absolutely. So, Norm, thank you. To the audience, thank you. We'll see you again soon for another edition of the News Project Live. Thanks again, and have a safe week.
Thank you so much. Bye.